that will revolve around the themes of taxonomy and blended finance and many other important topics. Many countries have set very high ambitions to reduce greenhouse gases emissions to zero by 2050. But reaching these objectives, as Minister Calvino explained a moment ago, would entail trillions of investment, certainly in Europe, and even much more trillions outside of Europe. So the international dimension of our global effort to finance decarbonation is extremely important. As Mike Bloomberg said in his introductory remarks, the European Commission has launched what we call the International Platform for Sustainable Finance, the ambition of which is actually to share expertise about the various initiatives around the world so that nobody has to reinvent the wheel, to exchange know-how, to help each other, building a consistent regulatory framework around the world to foster investment into decarbonation projects. So that's an extremely important project. We have already some very key jurisdictions representing a sizable part of the global GDP, China, India, Canada, Argentina, but also Kenya and Morocco, for example. And of course, this is a platform that is open to everybody to join in order to broaden the scope and as a vocation to become truly global. We rely for this on a number of tools to bring more transparency in the market, to bring more awareness in tackling climate risks, to make investors in a capacity to truly make the right choices. But to fulfill this enormous investment need for the global transformation, we will need to coordinate these investigations. That's why it's extremely important that we have some key global regulators today, and Ashley, both in his capacity as the head of the Hong Kong regulator, but also maybe even more these days as the head of IOSCO. Thank you, Ashley, for being here. Let me introduce the rest of the panelists. Unfortunately, Minister Yatani couldn't be here with us, but we're fortunate to have Dr. Julius Muya to stand for him. Dr. Muya is the Principal Secretary for the National Treasury in Kenya. Ashley, just introduced, is the chair of IOSCO board. Jean-Jacques Barberis, immediately on my left-hand side, is the head of institutional and corporate clients coverage and executive board member of Amundi. Tao Zhang, next to Jean-Jacques, is deputy managing director of the International Monetary Fund, and Margaret Killow is leading the finance practice at the WWF. So thank you, all of you, for being here with us. So I'd like to target my first question to Dr. Muya. Dr. Muya, Kenya has been extremely active and committed to sustainability goals, and in particular, your country has launched several initiatives on sustainable finance, including the issuance of the first green bond in Kenya. So I'd like to have an overview of how you see the state of play on sustainable finance in Kenya, and how do you manage the link between sustainability and development. The floor is yours.
Can I talk from here? I can talk from here?
Yes.
Yeah, well, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure, actually, to address you this morning. And has been said by the moderator, Kenya is conscious and deliberate and intentional about fast-tracking financing development using climate smart financing. And in this respect, what we have done is to pronounce ourselves politically, because it first starts with a political will. So at the national government level, the leadership is very clear in terms of pushing forward the agenda of climate financing. also at the county government level. And today I have one of the governors from Kenya, Governor Ochilo, if you raise your hand. So we have 47 county governments, and one of the county government is represented here. So we have a lot of interest at the county government level, so that what the national government is pushing, also the county government is pushing. Now, in terms of strategy, institutional framework, in terms of policies, we have put a lot of frameworks in place to support green economy and climate financing. And having issued the first green bond, which was very successful, it was subscribed by 2 times. We are looking to issuing a sovereign bond early next year. And this is an area where we are looking to support the money that is available from the exchequer, because it can't be enough, so that as we are funding development, we bring in private sector, we bring in development partners, and also we bring in other civil society organizations that can support the process. So for us, our capital markets is deep enough. We are working with the central bank, we are working with the Capital Markets Authority, and it's an inclusive process where we are bringing everybody in the process of making sure that we realize the green economy and green financing.
Well, thank you very much, Ashley. I'm very well placed to know that you're playing a very key role in trying to push everybody on planet supervisors, being very active on the issue as the chair of IOSCO. IOSCO, for those that are not financial regulation nerds, is the global standard setup for securities transactions. According to you, what is the role of market regulators in the transition to a more sustainable financial system? What can we do to help?
Well, market regulators, what do? They regulate disclosure of information by businesses to investors, and who then use that information to price financial assets and allocate capital. And it's absolutely plain that the opportunities, but more particularly the risks arising from climate change, are now undoubtedly key disclosure issues. Why is that? Well, the PRI estimates that climate policy could wipe up to 2.3 trillion, or 4.5% off the value of global stock markets. That's material. So our view, and in particular my view, is that reliable, comparable disclosure at corporate level is absolutely essential. In fact, it's a precondition for asset managers to integrate climate risks into their investment portfolios and disclose against that. It's absolutely essential to enable central banks to stress test bank corporate loan books for climate risks. And for taxonomies to be truly useful, you need to assess whether business activities qualify as green under those taxonomies. So where are we now? Right now, the disclosure around all of this at corporate level is neither reliable nor is it comparable. So that must mean that market regulators must work to promote disclosure of climate change risks and opportunities which are material, and also, very, very importantly, it's been mentioned in the previous panel, be laser focused on the greenwashing aspect, which is currently an increasing problem. So what next steps? And we do need to take next steps, because we're starting from almost a standing start at the moment on this. First, relatively straightforward, and I use the word relatively advisedly, is agreeing on the metrics and methodologies for disclosure of greenhouse emissions by corporates. Second, and this comes to taxonomies, make sure that we enable corporates to analyze revenues and expenditures so that their activities can be measured under taxonomies. Because unless you do that, the taxonomies are not going to be of much use, and that gets to a very difficult issue of accounting standards and financial statements. And then finally, and probably the most important, is this whole question of TCFD and how TCFD gets integrated into financial regulation. Now, it's an issue that some have avoided in the past because they basically put it in the too difficult box. It is very, very difficult, but that box needs to be opened and we need to examine it. It's all about this concept which is at the heart of TCFD, which is scenario analysis. The TCFD advocates the use of sector-specific scenarios to disclose physical and transition risks arising from climate change. And the problem is that scenarios are long-term, they're inherently uncertain, they need to incorporate difficult assumptions around carbon pricing, around carbon capture technology, around broadly sustainable finance policy, and also extreme weather. There are currently too many sustainability standards to choose from issued by third-party providers, and the output is mainly qualitative. In other words, it's very, very hard to judge from qualitative disclosures how companies are approaching their strategic resilience and adaptation to climate change. So what can market regulators do? We need to look much, much harder at standardizing inputs, assumptions, analytical methods, and outputs for industry sectors. And we need to think about what could be mandatory. And I'll finish just by referring to something that I think BNP said recently, which is this: unless regulators hammer out a plan for an orderly transition to a low-carbon economy, investors cannot know what their investments are worth, and that creates a catastrophic risk to global financial stability, as well as around climate change. So I'll leave it there.
Well, thank you very much, Ashley. A lot of food for thought. I have to say, we in the EU are facing exactly these questions at the moment. You may know that there was an agreement between the co-legislators or Council and the Parliament for the EU taxonomy last week. An agreement needs to be confirmed tomorrow by the member states. And of course, the taxonomy is only useful if it gives some light on the future and some predictability as well to investors. And Mrs. Botin was referring to this. I mean, if you know or if you suspect that the rules of the game might be changed, then you don't know really what to do as an investor, and makes things very difficult. Secondly, another point you made I'd like to pick is taxonomies will only be useful if they are, if not aligned, at least compatible around the world. And in this respect, we have started with China an exercise in order to see how we could make our two taxonomies compatible. And we would welcome other international partners to join. We think it's very important. Last but not least, TCFD principle. In 2020, the EU is going to revise its legislation on non-financial disclosures. And we're going to probably further include TCFD principles into our legislation. And indeed, what you say is absolutely right. I mean, it's good that there is flexibility, in particular for scenario analysis. At the same time, the flexibility should not allow you to game the system. And it's quite a big challenge in regulatory terms. Now, I'd like to turn to you, Tao Zhang. The IMF has joined the network of central banks for greening the economy as an observer. So is the Commission, by the way. I'd like to know what is your assessment, because it seems to me the IMF is best placed for this, of the impact of climate change on financial stability.
Thank you. Thank you. Is it on?
You will be on in a minute. Gone.
Hello?
Yes, speak.
Okay, great. Thank you, Olivier. And first of all, hello? Hello? Yes? Hello? Hello? Work? Work? Hello? Doesn't work?
A little closer.
Use this.
Okay, that's better. Okay, I'm doing this. Sorry for that. Thank you, Olivier, for the questions. First of all, I would like to thank the Spain and also the Chile's for sponsor this conference. I think this is very important, and we just heard from the Mr. Michael Bloomberg and the panelists in a moment ago that this is very much important. The financing cannot. It's very much necessary for to make the climate to make the climate change really works. So here, I think when Olivier mentioned what is the impact of the climate change on financial stabilities, that particular point, my own observation is that the climate change is rapidly at the center stage of the considerations of financial stabilities. And of course, in general, climate change had an impact on financial stabilities through mainly two channels. One is through, of course, the fiscal channels. The other one is through transition channels. Let me elaborate on both of them. The fiscal channel, I think, is very easy. Because of the climate change, you see more and more and stronger natural disasters, and which normally cause tremendous human and also property losses, whether or not it's hurricanes, strong wind, or drought, you name it. So some of the when the properties, when the investment engaged into these properties, which would occur huge losses, and then the bank or the financial institutions would have their balance sheet damaged, then that will certainly have the impact on their willingness and ability to lend. So in this case, then you would certainly ended up with the changes in terms of the landscape of financial service providers. For example, in the insurance sectors, when you have larger and more frequent losses, then of course insurance or insurance services could become more expensive and could become narrowly based. So that would reduce the diversity of the insurance services. So all these things basically change the landscape of financial services. Thus, will have caused the concerns of the financial stabilities as a whole. Coming to the second point, the transition risks. Because of the people's, the awareness and recognize the impact of climate change across the board, so there are some new regulations, incentives, or even restrictions coming in to various sectors. For example, in the oil extraction sectors, then people have to adjust. Before the economy find a newfound opportunities, then existing or incumbent industries will facing higher costs sometimes, will facing the losses in terms of the profitabilities. So these industries, when they in the process for transitions, they are facing the risks in terms of how they get access to finance. And so in that sense, the transition, how to handle the transitions is very much important. One of the things related to the ISCO, what they covered, these companies, when they put on the stock, their valuations could be adjusted quite in a big ways. What we have already seen since 2010, they're already top or big oil companies. Their values already has a huge adjustment. So these are post tremendous transition risks across the board. I have to say in conclusion that the risk is highly volatile and is non-linear, is in longer horizons. That is very difficult to calculate, put this way. That need a sort of a constant monitoring, and that's why this taxonomy is very, very important in terms of the common framework, in terms of the exposures, in terms of the standardizations. That's why. I stop here.
Thank you very much. No, keep this. Maybe somebody could mic again, Mr. for the second round of questions. Jean-Jacques Barbares, Amundi is a lead asset manager in Europe, maybe the lead asset manager in Europe. You have developed very interesting initiatives, notably with the World Bank Group, to launch the largest green bond initiatives in the world. So I'd like that you talk a bit about this and tell us a bit more about what impact blended finance can have in financing sustainable development in emerging markets, and the interaction between private investors and public finance. I mean, Werner Hoyer touched a bit about the issue earlier. I'd like to have a private sector perspective.
I hope it works. It seems to work. And thank you very much for the invitation and for the leadership on EIB and European Commission. I think we're all waiting for the Green Deal proposal, so good luck for that. I think it's important what is going to happen in Europe in these coming 2 days. So I would like to give a perspective as an investor. As mentioned, Amundi is the biggest asset manager in Europe. We manage a little more than 1.6 trillion. And I would like to focus a little bit on something very concrete, because I think a number of financial players are taking very big initiatives, very strong commitments about large numbers. But what is interesting is to have a little look at things that can work on the ground. And of course, regulation is of utmost importance. Taxonomy is something absolutely needed. But at the same time, we need to start acting now to make the bridge between the financial needs on the ground and our investors. And this is a little bit at the heart of the initiative I would like to spend a few moments on to explain why we believe it's an interesting example of how public and private finance can work together. If I give you the overall perspective, at the moment, the asset owners have on their balance sheet or on their portfolios a little more than 100 trillion in fixed income in the world. If you look at the green bond market so far, it's a market that represents less than $1 trillion, and it's mostly developed in developed countries, sovereign, quasi-sovereign entities. So basically it's a market that is growing super fast, but at the same time that does not help in financing the mitigation needs of emerging countries on the ground. And so the basic idea is, how can we help to make the green bond market locate itself or develop itself where it is potentially the most useful? And so that's a little bit at the heart of the initiative we had with the World Bank. And the idea was to say, initial question was, why does this market, doesn't it develop by its own in emerging countries at the moment? And here I think it's important to understand a concept that is parallel to the tragedy of horizon concepts that was developed by McCartney, that I would call the chicken and egg paradox that we're facing at the moment. We're facing the paradox that there are billions to be deployed in green financing at the moment, waiting for projects to be financed, and projects that are saying basically, I'm waiting to see investors being in capacity to deploy, and therefore you cannot make the match. And so for that, we strongly believe that to make this market happen, you need to work both on the demand side and on the supply side. And therefore, the program that we have created with the World Bank is exactly focused on that. So what did we do? We raised the biggest green bond fund in the world. It's 1.4 billion, which is not small if you look at the total size of the market, to be deployed in green bonds issued in emerging countries. And at the same time, with the World Bank and the IFC, there is a technical assistance facility to directly train people to issue green bonds to finance projects in emerging countries. So it means literally taking bankers of emerging banks to Stockholm to explain to them how do you issue a green bond and to make the match. So it's, I believe, an example of something that it's a good step forward. It's not enough for sure, but it's a good example of where is, I think, a good role for public finance. To be clear, I don't think we need public finance to make the green investments profitable at the moment. I think they are already profitable. To come back to one of the points that was mentioned by a previous panelists, the economics are working. They are already working for most of the investments we can do. But where we need some public finance is to be the sparkle for some markets that otherwise cannot happen. And in this fund, you have 70% of the money that is totally private, 30% that is public, but a small part of the public being invested in a tranche that is de-risking a little bit the private investors. And because of that, our investors came in massively. And so I think I would like to stop there, but for me, we don't need public finance again to make green investments profitable. They are already. I think we need them to kick off some initiatives, and we need them for two things that are particularly important for us, because the private sector can't do that. Notably one, which is to make sure that socially the transition is made acceptable in all our countries. That's where the public finance is mostly needed, and I think that's where public finance should be focused in the future primarily.
Well, thank you, Jean-Jacques. Also a lot of food for thought. Margaret, you are leading the finance practice at WWF. We've been working together for quite some time, and we at the European Commission can testify that there is a lot of expertise in WWF in the field of finance, and you've been a great help for our effort in the taxonomy, but also other key projects. So I think you're extremely well placed to tell us, at a time where we need to, I mean, the best jurisdictions in the world, and I think the EU is part of them, have actually been greening finance mostly so far, to some extent. We now move to financing green I mean, in large volumes if we want to be up to the challenge. So what are the urgent key steps policymakers should take to make that happen?
Very much, Olivier, and I want to echo the thanks to both Chile and Spain for putting this entire COP together so quickly and efficiently. And thank you, Olivier, and your team for the extensive work that you've been doing in the development of the European Sustainable Finance Action Plan. I think it's rare to see the public sector move so relatively quickly. If you think back just 2 years ago, the high-level expert group was putting together the ideas that turned almost immediately to the action plan, and now will hopefully result in the taxonomy when the vote happens. We look forward to that. So thank you very much for the leadership. One of the things that interests us about sustainable finance, and that I found interesting in particular over the last decade, in the last financial crisis, we were sort of brought together with what is the role of finance, essentially. And I think one of the positive outcomes of the financial crisis is that we're reminded that finance is a service industry to the real economy. And if we want the real economy to transition, finance needs to be there to support that transition. It's not finance acting alone, it's finance acting in service of the real economy. And the real economy acts in service of the society. Without finance, the economy, the society, all underpinned by the natural resources that we all rely on for that production, we won't get to anything that looks like a sustainable future. So The SDGs provide, the Sustainable Development Goals provide us a very nice framework to tie all these pieces together. Sustainable finance, green finance, the exciting growth in the green bond market, which has also extended to the green loan market, which may be just as exciting, if not more, I think, in terms of growth opportunities in that market. That still is focused on finding ways to finance things that are environmentally beneficial, which is important. But we can't forget that we also need to find ways to discourage activities that are environmentally harmful. The IMF has estimated the cost of fossil fuel subsidies about $5.6 trillion. At the same time, we're spending about $500 billion in impact investing. Great market. It's great to see it grow, but that's not the proportion we need. We can't be spending $5.6 trillion of our economy in fossil fuel subsidies and $500 billion focused on positive impact investing. So I think the simplest way to describe what policymakers need to do, make it faster and easier to invest in environmentally beneficial activities and make it harder and more expensive to invest in environmentally harmful activities. There are lots of details underneath both of those, but that's the very simple takeaway.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Margaret. I'd like to move to a second round of questions. We have 10 minutes, so I'd like you to stick to 2 minutes for your answers. And if we're lucky, at 12 o'clock, we should have Professor Stern to address us. I'd like to start again with Dr. Muya. Kenya is a member of the International Platform for Sustainable Finance. Kenya has endorsed the Helsinki Principles of the Coalition of Finance Ministers. So I'd like to have your perspective as a developing countries of why it is important that developing countries in general, Kenya in particular, join this type of initiatives.
Thank you, Olivia, and my co-panelists here for the messages that are coming through. And I want to say, as a developing country, you face the challenge of, one, you are relying a lot of times on sectors that are challenged by climate. Like in our case, we have agriculture, we've got other sectors, even transport, energy. They are all affected adversely by climate change. So you need then to look for financing outside the normal budgetary process that can then bridge the gap. In any event, the budgetary process does not generate enough money to fund the development projects that you have. And so we also need to find other ways in which to bridge that gap in terms of financing. Now, for us, as a country which is within the equator, the extremes of drought, the extremes of floods come in very quick succession. And so we are alive to the reality of climate change, and therefore we need to look for sustainable financing mechanisms, financing tools, financing frameworks, so that we can be able to stay in and do the things that we want to do and play catch up. Because in terms of infrastructure, in terms of other aspects of development, we have been left behind. And therefore, the way to gallop, accelerate, and be with the developed countries is just to do the right things. And therefore, sustainable finance for us, it is a must. It is the way to go. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Julius. Ashley, under your leadership, IOSCO has launched the Sustainable Finance Network. We commend you and thank you for that. I'd like that you elaborate on your views about why is it important to have a coordinated approach around the planet, how to ensure it, and also what are the challenges of potentially uncoordinated approaches.
Yeah. Well, I'm based in East Asia, in Hong Kong, and I look at the efforts that have been taken in Europe, and tomorrow there's the big announcement around the Green New Deal for Europe, from the perspective of East Asia and China. And the one sort of thing I'm conscious of, firstly, Europe is without doubt taking a leadership role, and you've created a sustainable finance platform in order that others around the globe can join in that effort. But I'm always reminded from where I sit that roughly half of the annual CO2 emissions is East Asia, and that currently coal generates around 40% of global electricity needs or services that, and over 50% of that is in China. And on top of that, there is an increase, most recently, of a build-out of new coal-fired plants. So that's just to illustrate that even if Europe does the absolute maximum it possibly can, recognizing all of the very difficult social policy transition issues that have been mentioned, that still will not alter the trajectory. Now, in order to meet the 2-degree goal, that nearly all of the China coal plants would need to be phased out by 2035. So that just demonstrates the scale of what we must do. Now, the tools we have available to us are those that I mentioned earlier on from a financial regulator's perspective, which is around taxonomies and disclosure, unless they're sufficiently consistent, which is a very difficult thing to achieve, then you will not get the outcomes you hope for. There's no doubt about that. So the ambition for market regulators, and I put this group together in IOSCA, which is called the Finance Network, is to do exactly that. Now, it's a hard job because we are, as market regulators, like any international organization, we're a very broad church. When you look at even the topic of taxonomies, you get into major difficulties around definitional issues and stages of development in different countries already. So but unless you establish these global networks, you're not going to get to the stage where you've got the right people in the room in order to get to consistency. And without consistency, you will not have impact.
Well, thank you, Ashley. Jean-Jacques, well, as a global investor, an asset manager, you are in a privileged situation to tell us what, in your view, is chiefly important in international cooperation between regulators for people like you to be able to make it happen. Because we don't finance, we finance only to a minor extent. You're the one that needs to tell us what you need.
First, I would like to echo what the colleague of WWF said. I think, yes, clearly the financial community is moving forward, but clearly not at the right speed. So I think we're late, to tell the truth. Maybe we're later in some parts of the world than in Europe, but I think we're late. And to come back to your question, I think what is the reason why we're late? I don't think it's anymore a reason of awareness. I hope you wouldn't find any member of the financial community that doesn't understand that there won't be profitable investments on a dead planet. I don't think it's a question of performance or the performance debate. I think this is clearly behind us. We can make the proof based on the math that's basically investing through ESG approach that can be criticized. Nevertheless, it's good for performance. So I think it's no longer the question. I don't think the question is about the data. I'm sorry to be not completely aligned with what Mr. Bloomberg was saying. I don't think it's data the problem. I think we're overflooded with data. I think if you look at all the ESG ratings that I am buying as an investor, the correlation between all of these ratings is less than 70%. For a credit rating, the correlation is almost 100. It means that I fundamentally challenge the quality of the data I have at my disposal, and I think I'm overflooded with. I will not quote any provider, but if I look at the carbon emission criteria for one of the most important ones in the world, you've got 70 data points to measure what you do. How do you want to use 70 data points, 60% of them being qualitative? It doesn't work. So I think what clearly we need is, for me, two things. It's clearly we need guidance on the data. It's not data we need, it's guidance on the way to use data, and that's why the taxonomy can be extremely useful. But here I would like to have a caveat. For sure, a global taxonomy, such as a global carbon price, would be the most efficient thing in the world. The problem is that if we're waiting for that to happen, it's just like Godot, we're going to face a huge problem because that won't happen like this. So I think that's the problem we are facing at the moment. And therefore, what is, I would say, our main responsibility is to equip ourselves intellectually and technically trying to address the challenge. I take an example. I think this morning was released a very interesting study made by the Inevitable Policy Response that is trying to give investors a way to assess their portfolios, considering the fact that an inevitable policy response is going to happen and what is going to impact. And here, if I have one call to action to all my fellows, it's to equip themselves with these kind of methodologies progressively to deploy. Sorry, I've been too long.
No, it was interesting, so you're forgiven. Tao Zhang, Mrs. Georgieva has recently emphasized the climate change as an existential threat, which is what it truly is. Where do you think the IMF should play a role in the future, and what are the next steps that you contemplate in your strategy? 2 minutes is challenging.
Thank you. As you know, the fund is working towards the safeguarding the economic financial stability so that we can promote trade and growth and raise up living standards. So in that respect, in meeting the climate change challenges, we committed to make the economy greener, which means the greener finance, greener investment, greener economy, greener growth. So in that respect, we take measures working with our memberships on both try to mitigate the impact of the climate change, while at the same time try to strengthen the adaptivities of the economies of our memberships both ways. Whenever the measures can be mitigate the impact, whatever the measures can strengthen the adaptations of the memberships economies, we will do it. Since we're talking about financial stabilities, of course, let me go a little bit in details on what we do in the financial sectors. One is we are strengthening our efforts to working with our economies to improve our stress testings, improve our financial stability assessment. Pilots already put it on in the case of the Bahamas and Jamaica, and also we're working with the network of the central bank on the climate change. And of course, one last thing is we're working with the Financial Stability Board on the data disclosures, and let alone, of course, we work with the World Bank and United Nations, including this time the Coalition of the Finance Ministers for Climate Actions. So I have 2 minutes. Stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sharp on time. And ladies last. Margaret, WWF is investing quite a lot in energy in connecting people, decision makers, etc. So I'd like to have, in 2 minutes, your perspective about how important it is to foster international dialogue around the relevant parties and how to make that happen.
Sure, thank you very much. Three quick things. First, the recommendations of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure need to become mandatory. I'm glad you're taking that up. We've had enough time to try and run the scenario analysis. The physical impacts of climate are hitting us much more quickly than we had expected. So the primacy on getting that information out available much more quickly in a standardized fashion is really top. Second, any of us who work in this space, we need to stop calling this reporting non-financial reporting. Climate impacts are not non-financial reporting. It is clear there are many, many publications that have been put out this week alone demonstrating over and over there are financial impacts clear and present from climate. And last, to go back to your work on taxonomy that started with the high-level expert group, the reason this has worked so well is because it's interdisciplinary. I'm struck when you go to these meetings that you sit in with the NGOs and they speak one language with their own acronyms, and the investors speak another language with their own acronyms, and the governments and the bankers and the insurance industry. If you can't bring them all together, you have to be patient, you have to learn, you have to listen well. But in order to solve problems exactly like this, we need multidisciplinary approaches across multiple countries. Thank you, Olivier, for the leadership.
Well, thank you so much, Margaret. Maybe a word on this topic, and referring back to what Jean-Jacques said earlier, we don't necessarily need a world taxonomy. What we need is a world taxonomy at some point, and what is aligned on a 2050 goal of being climate neutral. But the adaptation path will have to be different. We're not going from the same starting point. So these taxonomies have to be compatible. They have to be built on the same principles, but they will mechanically be different. And this is what we should try to work on internationally. Now, thank you for the panelists. I'd like to give them a round of applause. And it is our pleasure and our honor to welcome Professor Stern. It's both extremely difficult to introduce you and extremely easy because you're so well known. You're a half god to my 13 years old who is walking every Thursday in the streets of Brussels. I had to explain her the difference between a god and a messiah, and tell her that it's not yet clear exactly whether, and it's not depend on you, whether where we're heading to is the end of our civilization or salvation of humankind. But the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can I check that this mic is working? So I'll give you that one. Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. That was a very unusual introduction. We hope that your daughter will come to the London School of Economics. Yeah, and that I would like to say that one of the great drivers of optimism, I know it's not always easy to be optimistic, but is the way the young people have become engaged over the last 4 or 5 years is absolutely wonderful. And they should be giving us a hard time. We deserve it, but they are, and they should carry on. So please send my best wishes to your son and daughter. Now, obviously we're running behind time. I'll try and keep it down to 10 minutes if I can. I've got some slides here, but what I wanted to do is start with the macro story, the urgency and the scale of investment, and then I'll go into a little more detail of how we bring finance behind that big story. But it's very important that we remind ourselves at the beginning how big this story is. Very roughly speaking, the world economy doubles in 20 years. A growth rate of just over 3%. Asia will probably grow at 5-6%. Some parts of the richer world at 1-2%. It'll probably average out around 3%. And for the argument here, the decimal points really do not matter. This is a scale point. World economy doubles in 20 years. We have to cut emissions absolutely in those 20 years by at least 40%, just for 2 degrees. For 1.5, much more. So in 20 years, you have to cut emissions per unit of output by 80%. If the new economy that comes in the next 2 decades is zero carbon, that's nowhere near good enough. You've got to cut the overall by 40%, absolutely. So it's very important to be clear about the scale of what we have to do. Our infrastructure investment, which will drive most of this, will probably double in less than 20 years. Population of world cities will probably double between 30 and 40 years. This is the decisive moment in the investments we make, particularly the infrastructure investments we make. Those infrastructure investments in the next 10 or 15 years will settle whether or not we have any chance of holding to well below 2 degrees and 1.5. The decisions on those infrastructure investments are made now, because if they're going to occur in the next 10 or 15 years, we're talking about the immediate future. So we mustn't lose sight of the urgency in all this. This is quite extraordinary change. Now, we know that if we get it right, there is a very attractive growth story here. Much more efficient economies, resource efficient economies, much more energy efficient economies, much cleaner economies, cities where you can breathe and cities where you can move. Full of discovery, innovation, investment and growth. A classic Schumpeterian story of transformation and disruption leading to strong growth. This is very attractive. We have to manage it because dislocation can hit certain places and certain people very hard. But we have ideas, we should, and we have a responsibility to manage it well. So this sense of urgency, but also the sense of attractiveness of where we're going to. But of course we've got to get the details right. Where shall I be pointing this? Oh, it's over there. Okay. Very good. I pointed at that. I was pointing it there. I should be pointing here. So very quickly, we have a world which has got interest rates on the floor. We have a world whose macroeconomy is demand constrained. In other words, it's not that the savings are too big, it's that the investments are too small. And that's the world we live in, particularly in the context where these very important investments have to be made quickly. So that's the world we live in. So what do we need? We need the policies that can turn these wonderful opportunities into real programs. And we need a financial system that provides the right kind of savings in the right place at the right time on the right scale, including, of course, the management of risk, which is central to the story. So we have the urgency, but we also have the opportunity in the world's macro economy. And that's the challenge of policy. So we first, left-hand side, I hope these slides can be made available. I've got too much to go into the detail, but you've got to get the policies right, and they have to be credible, sound in terms of carbon and so on, and credible in terms of the confidence that they generate. We have to reform the financial sector in the kinds of ways that were just being discussed here, so I don't have to repeat, but through the network on greening the financial system, the task force on climate-related financial disclosure. I agree absolutely. The sooner that goes mandatory, the better. We need a few countries to lead on that. That's top of Mark Carney's list when he leaves the Bank of England in the early part of next year, and good luck to him. We'll be helping him along the way. And you need, of course, the reform of the development finance institutions, the MDBs, the International Development Finance Club, so they are aligned. And they've said in public strongly in Paris, in New York in September, that they will align. And of course, now we have to define what aligned means. You were talking about taxonomy on the panel. I tried to think in terms of what does alignment mean. And you have to look at everything from the strategy to go to net zero sectorally for the economy as a whole, all the way down to the projects and the project selections in the MDBs, in the private finance and so on. So Align looks at that whole spectrum from the very micro to the big story. We have the coalition of finance ministers on climate action. It is wonderful that we had a whole day yesterday, and this is the first time really that a COP has had a finance ministers coming together and saying, well, this is our responsibility, this is the new growth story, we've got to move quickly, how do we do it? And they will have to be directly involved in this. Putting this story together, You've got to look now, looking at the details of what alignment means. You've got to put the whole package together. That means public finance. Remember that infrastructure, depending which country you're in, but infrastructure is roughly 50-50 public finance and privately financed. You've got to have the strong public finances to make that happen. But always remembering that if ever you're going to borrow as a government, now is the moment to borrow with interest rates on the floor and a very big investment need. So the public finances, the international public finance, the MDBs, the IDFC, and of course private sector investment. And as we think about mobilizing, we've got to have that macro view. The scale is, there we are. Just to remind you of scale, we're going to be investing in infrastructure. You can do the sums in different ways, but over the next 15 or 20 years, 80 trillion, 90 trillion, 100 trillion. Again, decimal points don't matter. This is a really big infrastructure investment challenge, and the big stories are there in energy, transport, water and sanitation. Telecoms, big part of that, of course, in the cities. I've got one, next slide please, next one. This is for the economists. If you're thinking about policy, top of the list is the carbon externality and the carbon price. But you've got to work on the research and development. You've got to work on the capital markets. We've already been talking about the role of the MDBs and so on in managing risk and helping reduce risk, working with the private sector. And that's what you've been discussing just now. Many examples, Amundi and the IFC, of course, being a very important one. So we've got to manage that imperfection. Transparency, of course, TCFD being a very big part of managing those market failures. A lot of this is about networks, public transport, electricity grids, broadband, recycling. Those are networks. And in order for those to function, you've got to have platforms for those networks. Absolutely fundamental. It doesn't have to be public ownership. Sometimes it might be. But it has to be public policy, because without public policy, networks cannot function. Information of fundamental importance. People want to know what they're buying, for example. Producers want to know what's available. And finally, a very flat word, co-benefits. We kill several million people a year in the world from air pollution, moving strongly on phasing out quickly the fossil fuels will help enormously in that. In my own country, in the UK, we kill 30 to 40,000 every year from air pollution. We kill 1,700 from traffic accidents. So we kill, perhaps 20 times from air pollution. If traffic accidents doubled one year to the next, it would be a public emergency. Well, air pollution, 20 times the traffic accident. So that last one here, co-benefits, a bit of a flat word. There are some very powerful effects that if we move quickly, we get to avoid. So public policy to draw through on all those fronts is absolutely fundamental. But let me finish on an optimistic note. Can we do that? Well, to coin a phrase, yes, we can. The interest rates on the floor, extraordinary technical progress. When we published the Stern Review 13 years ago, it was 1 year before the iPhone. Now we have digital management potential in energy, transport, cities, in a way we couldn't have imagined just a dozen years ago. And we have, of course, the new materials and the great advance in renewables and so on. We do have the Paris Agreement, and the Paris Agreement has actually been remarkably robust. On the whole, it passed the Trump test. He said, I don't like it. We said, we're getting on with it around the world. Now, he didn't help, but that has been resilient, and that's the challenge. We've got to keep it resilient and keep moving. And finally, actually, where we began, which is the pressure that the young people are bringing is absolutely wonderful. I'm probably older than most people, perhaps all people in the room, but we in the 1960s, we fought on Vietnam, we fought on apartheid, we fought on civil rights in the US, and we were angry, and we were right to be angry. I'm not saying that the results that we saw, that we were seeking, came through so quickly, or that it was down to us. There were big things happening in the world. But now the young people are angry again. They're analytically angry. They're angry for the right reasons and pushing us hard. And that actually makes me optimistic about taking this opportunity. It's an enormous opportunity. We mustn't pretend that it's easy. But if we get it right, it's enormously attractive. And obviously we owe that to our young people. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Stan, for being with us today. Thank you.